which is something similar to what she would have had to design herself when she was making these gowns. And a lovely Mrs. Cog tag, happiness is a full bobbin. Sorry about the light there, that's casting shadows a little bit. And we have a tuck here made out of some sewing paper, like a pattern paper, which just flips out there. And in here I've put on this really soft paper. It's tracing paper, but it's actually how to use the ruffler on your sewing machine, and that's something that I'm sure she would have had to use quite a bit, because all those gowns that she made for the theatre would have had ruffles on them, so I thought that's something that she would definitely have in her kit is a ruffler. And we have a picture of her here. It's a bit fuzzy. Some of the holiday photos that she went on, and having a bit of fun. She seemed to be a person that was quite capable of having fun. She wasn't going to let anything get her down. And some more gowns with buttons on the end of the tags in the middle. Some graph paper, another lovely long gown with some beautiful lace trim along the edge, some scissor stamps. Now most of these are Tim Holtz stamps, these his sewing collection. And here we have a wonderful story. I just have to read this out because it's just such an interesting thing. She says, I met a lovely lot of people, including one I can remember. You might have even heard his name, Chief Little Wolf. He used to come in for breakfast with his family, and he was a lovely man. One time I said to Reg, I'd love to go and see him wrestle. So we went to Rushcutters Bay, where the stadium was, a big iron galvanised arena. We were standing in line, and there was this almighty blood-curdling yell come from inside the arena. I grabbed Reg's arm and I went for my life. So I've never seen a wrestling or boxing match in my life, and that was my one and only. Scared me off is right, she said. So she was actually working at a restaurant at that time. It was very early in the piece, when she was about 16 or 17. And part of her job was to actually meet and greet people and sit them down at the restaurant. And so she used to meet people like that. It was, like I said, in Sydney, it was a very bohemian, busy area. There were a lot of tourists and visiting people. So here we have a pattern pocket, which is quite something she'd have a lot of lying around, I reckon, a few patterns. And another, I think, Tim Holtz stamp there. And over here we have Elaine later in life. Now, Elaine only passed away a couple of years ago in 2017, and she was 86 years old. So she did a great job to get that far. And towards the end of her life, she took up painting. And she always said she'd like to do that, but she never really, got the energy to put into that until later in life. So here she is with her painting group, her painting friends. Now, those who know the family know that her sister, Edna Reed, is quite a good painter, and she probably didn't want to step on her toes. Now this is a picture of an old truck. When she was bringing up the children, she was one of those women who were rather forward and out there and thought she was going to get on with life, as a lot of women in her era did. they were the forerunners, and they actually took up the idea of, it wasn't a man's world anymore after the war. They had to get in and have a go. And not that many women were driving then, so they were learning to. So she learnt to drive in an old Chevy truck, and this was the style of thing. It was a fruit and veggie truck that was used for delivering fruit and veg. So she was determined that she was going to take her kids to school and get about where she wanted to, because it was quite isolated in the area that they were living, and they wouldn't have been able to get about easily without a licence. And her kids went to school in the city in Hobart, so I mean it's half an hour's drive for her to get them down there. And here we have a lovely piece of, can you see that there? Another lovely applique piece with pretty stones hand sewn into it. So that's the kind of thing that she would have worked into dresses and that sort of thing, with the gold threading around it. Everything was quite ornate back then. They liked to have really fancy bits and pieces on their dresses, and debutante balls, they went all out. They were much the same as really the wedding dresses and the bridesmaids' dresses. They were quite fancy. So here we have poctulope. I think I've got that right. And that's a big, huge, big button on there. So it makes these beautiful poctuculopes online. I'll put the link below so that you can look her up. And this is a lovely card from, it's A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's a library card. This one is from Gibbard Neary. Hi Gibbard, who's I'm a great fan of. She makes the most gorgeous library cards with beautiful flowers on them. And Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare, well, I mean, of course, Elaine would have had to do Shakespeare productions, and she would have had to make the clothing to go with that, so I thought that suited her very well. Yes, so down here we've got a silver tassel. We have another envelope here with a fancy little clip on it, which comes off so you can read it. And this is Costumes Made by Elaine O'Neill, as successful as ever it's been. So we have some more outfits, and look at the wigs on that. I mean, to design and make those in such a short time, it would have been quite difficult, I would think. So they're like newspaper clippings of theatre productions that she would have been involved in. Graphics fairy picture of a beautiful lady at a Singer sewing machine sewing some gorgeous cloth, absolutely beautiful, with flowers and things on. And I just imagine her Elaine to be like that in her sewing days, in the early days when she was first starting out and trying to make a name for herself. Not that it took long, because once people realised how good her sewing was, they flocked from everywhere. So here she says, I always wanted to paint, but I never got around to it because I was always doing sewing and designing, all that sort of jazz. So at 70 I decided it was the time the needle and thread went down and the paintbrushes were picked up. And probably because of my designing skills, I found painting relaxing, and I seemed to get there very quickly. My first paintings were pretty amateurish. So here we have Elaine and her husband starring in a show themselves, The Merry Widow. So not only did she have to make the costume, she actually had to act in them as well at times. So Elaine played the Lady of the Court and Reg Kromov. So they are in outfits made by Elaine for the Merry Widow production. A bit there so you can see. Hopefully that is where you can see. So we've got a tuck spot up the top of here, so we've got a little spot to put things up above, and we have a sewing dummy and some very pretty fabrics from wedding dresses here. So we've got a lovely lace that sparkles, beautiful applique, white and cream laces that you would find on wedding dresses, and a wedding dressmaker's dummy, and some design petticoats, hoop petticoats that would have gone underneath. They are all from the Graphics Fairy. Some scissors, Tim Holtz scissors, and embroidery for fine muslin. There's an embroidery pattern there. Evening toilette for a young lady. So that very intricate design, if I can hold it still, is the kind of work that she would have created for productions. It's just the kind of outfit she would have had to make, and headpieces as well, so she did the lot. Here we have some coats of spun nylon and another little flip out sewing pattern from McCall's. And this is Elaine as she grew older. As a young girl here, she was quite beautiful. Quite a beautiful young girl. And here as she grew older. So that's quite an achievement for her to have reached that age with ovarian cancer. It's not very often heard of. And she would have gone through so much treatment in her lifetime. So there in the middle we have another of the outfits that she would have had to create for different events. The fancy little headpieces on the top, and again we've got buttons on the tails. Oh, you can see there. And we have a tuck pocket there that's made out of a sewing pattern book, sewing pattern bag, And here we have her Nutrimetics colours, like apricot, like all their products come in apricot. So that was a major part of her working life. It really helped her to get along in life. And she met a lot of people, and it probably kept her occupied and quite busy. So she didn't have time to think about it. We have a flip out here, which is ledger paper and little sewing Tim Holtz stamps on the front of that. And I think the family should be able to tuck lots of little treats away in that. A lovely old Singer sewing machine here, and here we have a little tuck-in needle book, which is for tucking your needles and things in. So it's just got a little bit of collaging on the front with some satin fabric and the kind of things she would have to sew onto dresses, and a hat pin there, which she would have used a lot. A lovely button and a sewing machine. And to her, the most important thing in her life was her family. So everything she chose to do or not to do was because of her family. And when she actually moved to Hobart towards the end of her life, before she went back to the mainland to be with her daughters, she was offered a job away from her family, and she turned it down. So she really wanted to be there for them. With a lovely big hat pin there, and some spots that you poke needles and a needle book there. So that tucks back in there. And last but not least, we have another Through the Eye of the Needle from Mrs. Cogg's collection, which just tucks in there. We have the lovely sewing model paper in the back of the book. And the back of the book has the lace, crocheted lace trim. Okay, so bring that back over and zoom out a little bit so you can see. Oops. The additional part where she would have kept all of her notes. So this little book actually is a notebook that she writes notes about her sewing, and it contains needle packets and bits and pieces that she would have used for her work. Like she just tucked in pockets, receipts, and different little odds and ends. She would have made notes, things she needed to get. She was very good at salvaging things on a low budget to create, so she would have had to go and find all sorts of bits and pieces that she could put together to make these outfits with. And so this is like a little notebook that she would have carried with her and poked bits, just bits in here, buttons and bobbins and just things that she would have, scissors, odds and ends that would have been useful to her daily work. So that's just an additional instructions to her sewing machine. So that's the dressmaker and that's the milliner. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed that, and see you next time. Bye. The Dressmaker, Elaine O'Neill. Elaine Ellen Gill was born on the 8th of August 1930 at Carrington Street, Revesby, New South Wales. Her grandfather, Oscar Peacock, was a stonemason from England. Her parents struggled financially and moved to Port Kembla after losing their home. Elaine's father set up a butcher's shop, but was a kind soul, allowing too much credit to customers during the tough times. They lived near a steelworks, and the women hated the black cinders settling on their freshly washed sheets. Elaine's sister Edna was born in 1940. Elaine was always very good at sewing at school and made a beautiful embroidered nightie that one of the teachers purchased for her own honeymoon. At 13, Elaine made her first dress for a paying customer, her grandma Peacock. Her mum Betsy made her wonderful costumes as a child, one made of taffeta and lottery tickets with glitter. As she grew older, her aunt, a professional sewer, made her outfits for her. Elaine's first sewing machine was a Singer treadle. Her first real job was as a milliner. After her father came home from the war, she remodelled his army hat into a more practical street hat. She sewed for the rest of her life. She also made fiancé Reg a very authentic hat for the Shakespearean play A Comedy of Errors, only to have the director decide it was too good for Reg and passed it on to the principal. Elaine was most put out, but got her into the theatre sewing industry. Elaine had many jobs early on. In the school holidays she worked in Coles at the haberdashery counter. Then she worked for a photographer, a Russian fellow, followed by another, Sydney Riley, who paid better at £1 20 per week and took wedding pictures. In those days the stockings were rayon, which wrinkled until the end of the war when nylon ones appeared. They were so expensive that a kiosk in the Strand Arcade repaired them invisibly for £1 an inch. Elaine then went to work for a milliner in Market Street for a couple of years. At 17 she met Reg at a theatre and film league afternoon. He was so taken with the little blonde he cast her in a play to make sure she came back. Elaine joined the theatre group, the Australian Films League, and went on outings and picnics with Reg, and they became engaged just before her 18th birthday. Reg was 24. Reg even turned down a prestigious job offer in the Mercury Theatre to get engaged, considering it a job suited better to a bachelor. Elaine went to work at Carhill's restaurant as a hostess to greet people. She often met famous people there, and one morning a lovely wrestler named Chief Little Wolf came in for breakfast with his family. Reg and Elaine were married in 1949. Elaine at 19 made her own dress, the bridesmaids, the mother of the bride's dress, and along with that all the hats. They took a steam train to Wallachia for their honeymoon. There was a coal strike on and the power went off all the time. Housing was hard to get due to the priority of returned soldiers needing homes. They took a room and a front veranda in King's Cross, which was very bohemian at that time, but when Elaine fell pregnant they decided it was no place to bring up a child. Elaine came to the Derwent Valley from Sydney in 1951 with husband Reg and baby Madeline to live at North Crescent, New Norfolk, in the housing estate built for workers of the Australian newsprint mills, now known as Norske Skog. Reg was in need of work due to power strike and saw an advertisement in the paper for work with a house where a newspaper mill was opening in New Norfolk. They had borrowed money from both parents for the transport costs and headed off with a bedroom suite, cot, pram, bicycle, and a children's wardrobe stuffed with books. Reg was sent 3 months before Elaine and Madeline. A ute was sent from the mill to pick them up in the middle of a cold Derwent Valley winter. Elaine and 10-month-old Madeline were in the front, and Reg had to make do with the back tray along the winding road to New Norfolk in the bitter winter cold. The house at North Crescent was a prefabricated 3-bedroom home with a lounge room, kitchen, small bathroom and a toilet out on the back porch. It had a sink with a cupboard under it and an iron stove. The mill had dropped a load of wet hardwood in the yard for fuel. There was a copper to boil up hot water. The floorboards had to be polished. It had no fence or street light, and it was right on the edge of the bush. Elaine spent her first cold winter boiling up the clothes, putting them into cold water with a stick, and wringing them out with red raw hands. It became a bit of a shock for 21-year-old Elaine coming from the glitzy world of King's Cross. At age 24, her second child Helen was born, and then her world was shattered by the diagnosis of ovarian cancer. Elaine was given only 6 months to live, and she began the radical radiation treatment of the day, her only hope of surviving just a bit longer for the girl's sake. Elaine did not take this diagnosis lying down, and she fought each adversity head-on as it came along. The radiation, which she had for 6 weeks, for 20 minutes a day, had left her with many lifelong ill effects. She became a textbook case for doctors, specialists and surgeons. As her case was so unique, Elaine believed she was the oldest living Australian with ovarian cancer. During this period, her ability as a capable seamstress and pattern drafter became apparent, and Elaine's training as a milliner topped it off nicely, as patrons came from everywhere for ball gowns, wedding dresses, confirmation dresses, and matching hats. She learned to drive in an old Chevy truck, so she could take the girls to school and get about. Elaine opened a shop in Hackett Street, New Norfolk, to try and clear the house of all the sewing stock, but found it too hard to juggle all the customers and doing the sewing herself as well. Elaine became wardrobe mistress for the Theatre Royal Light Opera Company, where Reg was involved in acting. She worked her fingers to the bone 4 to 6 weeks prior to each show, but she enjoyed the design work and sourcing the materials. She learned to do lots of reinventing and upcycling. She also had her own experience with Fred the Ghost at the Theatre Royal one night while working on costumes with her friend Thea Dixon. They needed some buttons and she had left them upstairs while working on costumes. She left them upstairs on the piano, so she went up, and as she reached out for the buttons, a strange presence and a light appeared, giving her the cold chills. So she raced downstairs and told Thea they were done for the night and that they would finish the buttons tomorrow, and bolted off home. But Elaine didn't believe in ghosts. It was just Fred, and everyone knew Fred. They moved to North Hobart. Elaine was approached to design and dress productions for the Sydney Theatre Group, but she chose not to uproot her family and declined the offer. She also did work for the Tasmanian Theatre Company and the Tasmanian Ballet. She took on Nutrimetics natural skincare products as a sideline. She quickly rose through the ranks to become a director and received her own car, which was updated every 2 years. This gave her the opportunity to travel afar, and Elaine had many adventures to far-off places for conventions. All this while managing the illness her ovarian cancer constantly caused her. So determined was she to overcome it. She died on the 2nd of June 2017 at the age of 86.